A wonderful Thursday evening. And let me just clear the little recording prompt there. There's a lot of interest around AI in the world of computation, but I myself really love a good distributed papers talk, and we have one tonight. So we have a couple fun facts about Benjamin, our speaker, here this evening. They have been working on decentralized social networking for the past 15 years, as well as having some history back in the early days of blogging and podcasting. They now work at Protocol Labs. And a fun fact that you might not have been able to notice, but if you squint very hard and have really good resolution on your machine, you might notice they have two different colored eyes. That's right, if you can lean in right there. And with that, I will hand it over to Benjamin. Thanks so much for being with us.
Hi, you're welcome, my pleasure. I'm gonna take over the screen, is that cool? I assume so. Okay. Can you see this, the title slide?
We can see.
Okay, so yeah, the paper I'm talking about is not necessarily a traditional like academic journal paper or anything, but it's a document on the web that is a W3C technical recommendation called ActivityPub, and it is a federated social networking protocol that became a technical recommendation in 2018, but had a long path to get there. And so that's part of what I think is like kind of fun to go back and revisit and think about how would you design this type of thing today if you had the privilege of starting from scratch, and also like how do things evolve over many like stewards and periods of time to be able to like accrue the audience that some of these big social networks need to gather a lot of people. So we're going to talk first about the history of activity streams, which is like a subcomponent, I guess you could say, of ActivityPub, and the protocol itself. We're going to talk about the World Wide Web Consortium social working group that inherited some inputs and then produced these technical recommendations. And then we'll talk about like how people are using this protocol today, or ways you can use it, and then maybe also look at potential future work or like areas of open inquiry, the things that sometimes keep me up at night. But yeah, we'll first start with history. So we're going way back actually to like even before I was born. And this is something that like when I first came to San Francisco in 2010, I went to some meetups around like the evented web and like certain like distributed social things that, when I was new to town, and I actually became kind of intrigued by this whole thing, especially because they were connected in this technical effort to essentially like sociology or like social studies research. There's apparently this thing called activity theory that came from sort of like human-computer interaction and psychology studies, largely in Russia, and after like in the 90s, more like Western researchers started sort of looking into this and trying to figure out how they could apply these ideas to human-computer interaction, design of software and machines and stuff like that. I don't know that much about it. I just think it's cool that there's a lot of grounding in this that's not necessarily just like computational. And so also some of the history is like, this is what I was doing in 2005, blogging about Xboxes. And so that when I say I've been involved in this stuff for 15 years, it's just that like as a teenager, I really enjoyed the way the web was back then, where there weren't necessarily these big centralized social networks, but like anyone that could figure it out could maybe make a blog. People link to their friends' blogs. You could go and comment on different people's servers, and the whole web was sort of like a big social network that didn't always interoperate, but with things like RSS back then, you could follow really a lot of information, and you weren't necessarily reliant on one company to help you sort of sift through all that. You could join things on the client. At the same time, and around not that many years later, Tim Berners-Lee started talking about this notion of the giant global graph when he was talking about like thinking about the semantic web while at MIT running this decentralized information group lab. And even back then, this is when like a term Web 3.0 started being talked about and blogged about. And now it's been almost 15 years, and more and more people are talking about Web 3 now. but if you look all the way back, people have been talking about Web 3.0 for 15 years. And generally the idea was that by connecting all of the web pages with not just links between documents, but links between the data within those documents, you would sort of start to model this big giant global graph of information, not just documents, but sort of semantic information. And I thought that was kind of cool at the time. I also have this link down here to Social Thing, which was around the same time, was one of the first products I used, at least, came out of Techstars startup that helped you merge the activity streams of what was happening around the web into sort of like what we would now call a news feed or activity stream of the different things happening back then on like Tumblr or RSS feeds, or I think Twitter was launched approximately in 2007. So that was like an area of innovation back then. Also around this time, there was a project called DSO that was called Distributed Social. And I dug up their old website. You can sort of see some of the titles of the first blog posts around 2007, 2008. Chris Messina was active in that group. I think he might have started it. I don't know, but when I first came to San Francisco in 2010, he was still leading some meetups about the distributed social web. And that's sort of how I fell into this rabbit hole. Also around that time, and I think this is kind of related to the last slide, there are a couple open projects that were trying to standardize ways of doing distributed social web stuff. One is called OpenID, that's still around. OpenID Foundation is still a thing, and they define a protocol that is basically a flavor of OAuth 2 that is more specific and I think more implementable. But back then, there was OpenID 1, which we'll see what that looked like in a second. Open Social there's a TechCrunch article I'm looking to here from 2007 where TechCrunch was writing about Google's new project called Open Social and what that would contain. And you can see that the third element there is about activities, things that happen, and newsfeed type stuff. This was in a time where Facebook was like rising and people were using MySpace and stuff. There's like the only other slide about me, but yeah, around that time I had this like Tumblr blog. That's like me in high school on Spirit Week. I think it was like Disco Day or something. And you can see at 7 a.m. on April 28th, 2008, I was like, I can has online identity. It was just like, don't know what I was doing there, but also I've used, this is on the Wayback Machine, but I've used sourced, and you can see how from my website, which I happen to host on Tumblr, but I think I pointed my personal domain name to it back then. You could make these link relations in a sort of semantic web way to the authorization server of your choice. And so, even 15 years ago, people were sort of exploring ways of composing a social web out of a bunch of different servers. Maybe the place that hosts my documents is different than the place that knows how to authorize or authenticate me. And yeah, that was at a time where OpenID 2 had just come out. So I have like some OpenID 1 link relations and some OpenID 2 ones. This is from 2008. Google then announced the Open Social Foundation to start to try to potentially separate that work a little bit from Google and make it so that different organizations could adopt it. And it says here in the article that it wasn't just a Google thing, that this was also something where Yahoo and MySpace were sort of founding partners, and there was collaboration on social standards between some of the biggest tech companies. Also, there's this old mailing list from around this time. These are some of the oldest posts on it where people started talking about this notion of like activity streams. You see Chris Messina's name on there, but there were some other founding partners and stuff, and that's kind of fun to go back and troll through that Google group. So I have a link there. And then a lot of people don't know this, but at some of the earliest versions of the Facebook platform, when they launched the Open Graph API, which might remind you of the giant global graph that Tim Berners-Lee was talking about for several years ahead of time, but kind of along the same vein. Their original versions of the OpenStream API were actually used this nascent activity streams standard, which at the time described a way of describing social activity using XML and XML namespaces. And the earliest versions of Facebook actually implemented the standard, and it potentially helped them bootstrap this developer platform and sort of network of interoperable services. But those websites aren't live anymore. You have to go to the Wayback Machine. So I have the links down there too. Christine encouraged me to add this slide too. This was something I wasn't paying as much attention to at the time, but did influence the spec, which were around that time that big tech companies were starting to do social networking. There was a bunch of different sort of free software endeavors to try to do this in the open or in freely licensed code that wasn't sort of subject to the platform risk that some of these SaaS businesses can have. One is GNU Social, previously known as StatusNet, also I guess also once known as Laconica. Pump.io is a similar related project that was started by Evan Progermo, who worked in the social web working group we'll hear about later. Part of standardizing the API for that became known as ActivityPub, which I think influenced Christine in sort of originally authoring the ActivityPub protocol. But part of as these things are passed along, you never know whether you can use a name that someone else was using or who owns the trademark for these things. So a lot of times we had to come up with like slightly similar names. And then I also threw in here a link to a reference to Diaspora, which I definitely remember at the time being a project that I think I've discovered on Kickstarter, where some NYU students really wanted to make an open source federated social network, and they raised a good amount of money to do that. They had mixed success, and it was complicated. So the real thing that just blows my mind, and I think like a lot of young people don't really appreciate, that in 2009, Google, Facebook, MySpace, Microsoft, Yahoo, all use the same social networking data standards. And they may not have interoperated that much, but there was at least like sort of a standard way we described social data. People were trying to describe social data on the web, but that's, from my perspective, not really happening anymore. And so like, what happened? How can we get back? Is that even a good idea? That's sort of something I find myself wondering a lot. On the right side here, there's an insider take of how that initiative for Google to launch the Open Social Foundation landed with one of the Facebook co-founders. And in short, that basically says that, like, from his perspective, Google got all the other major companies behind NDA to commit to using Open Social, and then kind of sprung it on Facebook one day, and they felt sort of blindsided. And potentially that was a time where Facebook decided to stop interoperating and just sort of do their own thing. Though I don't, that's just like according to TechCrunch. I feel like this is a relevant concept that it happens, is a phenomenon that happens in some of these like standards communities where, you know, if there's an incumbent that's doing something and you want to compete with them or eventually try to take the lead, you can embrace a standard way of doing things so that you can leverage the incumbent's audience, then start extending the standard with sort of like specific capabilities that only your implementation supports. And the long-term strategy is you sort of like exterminate the whole interoperable ecosystem in favor of just like seeking market leadership on your own. And this was used by the Department of Justice in the 90s against Microsoft, but I think many actors sort of rationally take on the strategy. This is around the time, like, I kind of followed that stuff, especially as a teenager and stuff. Then I started working full time. I didn't follow it that much. And then I got this RSS item on my feed one time that was announcing that a lot of that work on Open Social was basically donated to the World Wide Web Consortium to be inputs into what the new social web working group. And this was at a time where like Google Buzz had kind of been shut down. Google Plus had been shut down. My understanding is someone told me once that internally some of those projects use some of the Open Social like Java code and stuff. But as those projects, you know, didn't reach success, the IP and name and stuff kind of got donated to the W3C. And that's when I was like, oh, that's cool. Like, I've always wanted to be participating in web standards, so maybe I'll get involved. And that was like the beginning of part 2, which was the social web working group. This is the website that kind of lists some of the recommendations that came out of that group, which, as far as I remember, was kind of active from 2014 to 2018, 4 or 5 years. There was not like a single thread of execution that everyone was aligned on. There were several different solutions pitched for potentially the same thing, but it was sort of a big tent approach to try to get things out. So there's not necessarily a clear way to make use of the outputs of that group, but here you can see some of them. I think it's interesting to go into what the charter of that group said, because I feel like it informed some of the design decisions. Like, in theory, we didn't want to do things that the charter didn't afford, and certain participants in the group really pushed on making sure that we didn't do anything too crazy and that we were staying within the goals of the charter. This talks about some of the use cases of why it might be worthwhile for the web to have an open social layer, things like end user control of personal data, so that the corporations that we in software businesses that we use to host our data don't disproportionately benefit from the data more than the people who generated it. People were working a lot at the time on different like ways of doing essentially web components that were like standard ways that you could render something like a document if you embed it on someone else's website. That was like a big part of what OpenSocial was working on. That part of things actually got carved out to not be worked on by the social web working group, but instead went to like the applications working group. And so some of those ideas ended up informing things like web components or custom elements that are pretty usable today. And enterprise social business, there's pretty much every major enterprise like software provider, including IBM and stuff, were making intranet social networks. Things like Yammer that Microsoft bought was a thing, and Salesforce made Chatter back then. So there was sort of this intranet social trend happening as well. And I would highlight section 3 here, which is, this is what the charter said that the social working group should do. They should make a social data syntax. So there's that's JSON based. That was like a big key. As we saw before, there was previously like a standard for doing all this in XML, but at the time, like no one, at least I was young, like I didn't want to have to learn how to do XML parsing. And a lot of people were doing more and more like JSON based stuff in JavaScript and in web development. A social API that would talk about how like a client application, maybe like a newsfeed type thing or a publishing tool could talk to a server that would help publish it on your behalf. And then a federation protocol that would make it so that like there wasn't just, so that all of the different servers speaking the social API could potentially collaborate to distribute things to people so that end users had like a choice of which provider to use. And there's some of these other inputs enumerated here, like activity streams we talked about, or LDP or web mention, that are worth looking at as well. Okay, so activity streams is something that the ActivityPub protocol depends on, but it's kind of its own like its own spec that doesn't really that ActivityPub uses, because this is essentially what fulfilled the deliverable of social data syntax, whereas ActivityPub fulfilled the deliverable of federation protocol. But this is basically what activity streams 2 looks like. It's a lot of what we were doing is like, this is a time where everyone was sort of making their own little way of using JSON to describe things. And so some people used like names, some people use display names, some people use title, all to refer to like semantically similar data attributes. And so there was a lot of just sort of, from my experience, in my opinion, like bike shedding of just saying like, hey, let's just agree to decide to call things a certain word. On the right, here's an example activity that would describe something like your friend did. It has a summary that's like plain text that you could show sort of in a condensed version. And this is an add activity. And in general, I would highlight that the general like fields that an activity would have is it's something that a specific actor did, probably in the past. There's a type which used to be called in earlier versions of activity streams like the verb. So an activity has an actor, a verb, and then depending on the verb, there may be things like an object, a direct object or indirect object. Starts to feel like in 8th grade or whatever, when we were doing like sentence diagramming to recognize like the parts of speech in a sentence, but this was kind of coming up with the machine readable way of expressing that like parsed English or like actions that were happening. So it's just JSON, it's not too complicated. People kind of wonder what this at context is doing at the top, and that's a thing that comes from JSON LD. But I would say, because the charter said that we were very specifically supposed to make a JSON syntax, like social data syntax, not a JSON LD social syntax, there was sort of this very intentional effort to say, you should be able to use this standard without having to worry about JSON LD, RDF, semantic web stuff. Like that stuff can get very complicated, and there's a lot of people that sort of burnt themselves out like trying to make that happen. And the goal here was just to be something that anyone could use, that as long as you knew JSON and could read a hash map. But that at context comes into play when we start talking about how people can make extensions to the protocol, especially in kind of like a permissionless way, where you don't have to like go through the bureaucracy of the working group to make an extension. You can define your own extension vocabularies, stuff like that. This is an overview of, so there's activity streams core, which is a relatively short document and just explains like the basics of the data model. And then there's a related document that's called the vocabulary that uses that data model to define a bunch of things that you would expect to potentially appear in a social network. So on the top left, we have like the core types. base classes, if you will. They are somewhat self-descriptive, but yeah, I guess I would highlight like activity is the example we looked at on the last slide. People also found it useful to describe like a collection of activities or a collection of bookmarks or something, a collection of objects. And then you might want to get into the semantics of like, is this collection something that has like a strict order that you might need to like page through a billion items in a well-defined way, or is it just like a set, like an unordered collection? And so there's kind of specific types for that. I mentioned that like every activity usually has like an actor, the actor that initiated this activity or sort of took action. And oftentimes in social networks, that actor is like a person. And so there's a sort of a type defined for person, but there's other types of actors in the world too, especially like bots, groups of persons or bots that take action as a group, as well as just like web services that are maybe responding to certain actions and generating their own as a result. So there's different kinds of actors. And there's a bunch of activity types here, which are like specific things you might see in a social network or a chat room or something, like someone joined the room, someone shared something, someone liked or disliked stuff. Maybe you want to undo things. These are just the basic primitives that people found a reason to encode here. And then on the right, there's some other things like at the bottom right, you see mention. Every different social network was doing this sort of like @mention feature, but there wasn't really a standard way of expressing those or parsing them out if you were like writing a script to absorb this data. So that's like a high level overview of a bunch of like the objects in play and activity streams. Now let's look at ActivityPub, which makes use of that. And this is making use of that data syntax for describing social data, but is a HTTP-based protocol for actually like how you would send those chunks of data around. And these diagrams, which are in the spec, are really helpful, I think, to focus on. Honestly, it works a lot like email, where a lot of us have email addresses. You can go check your email server for your inbox, which would have a bunch of messages or like activities from other people that you might want to browse. And then when you respond or you are sending a new message, you kind of post it to your email outbox. I sometimes wonder if we should have just like done more with email, but this was sort of like coming from a blank slate. It was JSON native and without some of the flexibility of HTTP, which honestly, when I first showed up and Christine was presenting ActivityPub that in 2014, I didn't really like that it wasn't RESTful in a sort of HTTP RESTful way. But since then, I think that I've come to see that there's a lot of value in just describing like a JSON payload that has all the semantics you need, especially because I think some interesting future work would be to do ActivityPub over non-HTTP transports, but I'll get to that in a bit.
Was the intention from the beginning that it was both going to be a protocol that worked over email and over HTTP?
I don't know. Like I wasn't there. Like I just showed up in 2014, and I don't know. Maybe Christine, do you have a point of view on that?
The spec is written in such a way that it can be more general than using HTTP, but also kind of does inherit some of the biases of HTTP. So for example, one of the things that we've wanted to add I've advocated is that you could use ActivityPub with something like IPFS, and then if you've got a post that's being referred to on IPFS and your server goes down, that post can still exist, right? So it's not specifically requiring HTTP, but there is kind of a little bit where it gets HTTP-ish, where you need to figure out what the equivalent is for get and post, basically, because those are the two HTTP verbs it uses for, as you can see in that diagram, for basically submitting things and retrieving things.
Yeah, and at the time I was like really frustrated. I was like, why are we putting all these verbs and these methods in the request body when like we could just use HTTP methods for that? That's like what they're for. I thought it was sort of redundant, but I personally find in hindsight that it actually decouples and makes things sort of orthogonal from HTTP in a way that I think is powerful. So yeah, this bottom right diagram is really helpful. It's like in the section 1 of the spec as an overview, and it basically just shows how an actor on the left might use their inboxes and outboxes to talk with someone, a different actor that's on a different server. And so the general flow, if I want to send a message to someone, is I articulate what that activity is, like I'm authoring a note or something. I can CC a friend's URL on potentially their own server, not just the same server I'm on. I then send HTTP post, send that JSON note into my outbox, at which point you follow the rules of ActivityPub to sort of parse that out, decide which other servers need to be notified about this activity because they're CC'd or maybe it mentions them or something. And then your server or the ActivityPub server that you're using is supposed to send HTTP post requests to all of those actors' inboxes, at which point their server does some processing and makes it available for the actor however they want. Yeah, so this is just a bit about actors, looking at the actors section of the spec, number 4. And this was also probably, like Christine was talking a lot when I first showed up in 2014 about the actor model, and I think that's definitely something that a lot of computer scientists are familiar with, and is a lot. I feel like it's kind of having a heyday right now in the design of a lot of like blockchain computation networks and things like that, where in some ways like smart contracts are just actors, and computer programs are in some ways just actors. And so really ActivityPub is just trying to provide a specific vocabulary for describing all these actors and some specific relationships that you might have, like related objects that an actor might have, like a stream of inputs and a stream of outputs, which kind of reminds me of communicating sequential processes, or whatever the CSP sort of pattern is that some people use to write programs. So this wasn't necessarily just like a random idea. I think Christine especially is who introduced me to this, and I think was informed by sort of a long lineage of computer science research and with regard to the actor model, which you can see down there originated in 1973. So this is sort of the remaining sections of the spec that talks about on the left. There's one other type of like that's defined as the collections that a server might maintain on behalf of an actor. So like the outbox and inbox are both collections of activities, but because there's a well-defined way of talking about liking and following other actors, your server I believe is required to also maintain like the collection of people that you're following, the collection of people that are following you, the collection of things you've liked, all these sort of things that might be useful for building a social network front end that a non-technical, like a non-programming end user might expect. That was the last bit of sort of like the data model. And then section 6 and 7 talk about how a client, in section 6, how a ActivityPub client would talk to a server, like exactly what needs to happen as maybe types a message, hits enter, what a client piece of software would need to do to encode that into the JSON syntax, and then submit it to a server in a certain way. And then depending on the activity type, what the server should do when it receives this message from a client. I think almost all of this is related to when a client sends a activity to my ActivityPub servers in outbox. So you author an activity, send it to your outbox, your server figures out how to replicate it to everyone else. Section 7 talks about server-to-server interaction, which happens next, which is, I just sent this note to my outbox. My ActivityPub server is, one of the things it needs to do is tell all the other actors on different servers what happened. And so there's a server-to-server interaction where this forwarding happens, or this replication happens, at which point my friend or acquaintance's ActivityPub server receives that in their inbox. And then there's sort of a related but slightly different set of semantic requirements depending on the type of activity. Like if your inbox receives a follow activity, you should add the actor who followed you to your followers collection. Yeah. So pretty basic stuff. We take a lot of this for granted now, but this is just kind of coming up with solving the bike shedding and just articulating like, this is one way we can describe this, even though there's a million other ways, and making this a bit more implementable so the whole distributed system can be predictable to an end user. This is ActivityPub security in quotes here, because especially at the time, I feel like it was almost like considered a best practice to just define your protocol, but like every implementer might want to do security in a different way. Maybe big enterprises want to do something with like SAML or whatever came before that, but OAuth was also in vogue at the time, and there's OAuth 1 and there's OAuth 2, and like in order to not get bogged down in all of those different and trying to pick one of them or make those interoperate, we were happy to just get anything published, but security and whatever that might mean was sort of left for future work. There was some mention of like some standards like HTTP signatures or like linked data signatures, OAuth 2, but some of those things weren't actually standardized. And so in like the end of the working group, a lot of the anything that wasn't also already a web recommendation or maybe like another standards body's recommendation, because they hadn't been through a formalization process, there was limits on the ability for this spec to link out to them or refer to them as normative language. And so these ended up becoming like sort of looser recommendations than anything that like with must or should language in them that would be sort of like normative. So I believe that that's been a sort of a barrier to interoperability since then, but basically a lot of different ActivityPub implementations will do like slightly different things with regard to security. And in practice, that's super important because you need to figure out like which requests your server should handle. You need to know whether there's a person in the middle that's rewriting requests that say they come from your friend, but actually someone's injecting like malicious JavaScript into it or something. Like data integrity is something that I didn't appreciate how important it was, but I think is really important.
Did that end up bleeding into identity at all? Because you didn't actually say how to authenticate someone?
Yeah, I mean, I think the closest I think the like non-normative text was basically like use OAuth 2, but in my experience implementing OAuth 2, like that doesn't really mean that much because OAuth 2 is a framework or like an architecture much more so than like a specific protocol you would definitely implement. That's why I think the OpenID Connect protocol, which is like a concretion of OAuth 2, is like really useful if you ever want to implement that kind of thing, which should have done in the past. But even that is like, you know, it's unclear where the lines between authentication and authorization start and stop. And there's completely other there's other architectures you could use for authorization that I'll talk about in a sec that Christine eventually taught me about that like might be better than OAuth. OAuth generally still relies on sort of some server being out there to do auth for you. And for example, if maybe you shouldn't have to go talk to some server to be delegating authority to post on your behalf or something, like in a perfect world, maybe you could just do that offline or without someone knowing that you're doing it. Does that answer your question, Aaron? Cool. My stance at the time was like, whatever, people are just gonna use OAuth 2, like we don't need to worry about that in here as long as we kind of tell people how to how an actor can point to their preferred OAuth authorization endpoint and OAuth token endpoint. Like it's pretty good and people use it. I don't think people actually really use those properties that much, but it's a big fediverse. Like I don't actually follow it. There's another document that came out of the working group that by a really awesome contributor to the group, Amy Guy, and it's called the Social Web Protocols. And like I said, the group produced like a bunch of different documents. They weren't necessarily like all perfectly aligned. There was potentially multiple protocols for doing the same thing, but this document basically is an overview of everything that came out of the group, what roles each standard fulfilled, what they didn't do, how they kind of juxtaposing all the different things. And this was like a really helpful project that Amy took on, I believe as part of her PhD thesis, that helped explain all the stuff to people and honestly helped a lot of the people in the group keep track of all of the competing ways of doing things. So I'm personally a big fan of that document as well. And that might be a better place to dive in than even like just the ActivityPub spec if you're curious about the other standards. I'll also highlight Solid, which is a project that Tim Berners-Lee's been working on around since that same time. I think it started at MIT in that decentralized information group that I mentioned earlier. My perception of Solid at the time was that I think that I recall reading something on a README at the time where they were basically like, hey, all of the social stuff about Solid social link data, that's happening in the social web working group. So as much as possible, I think Solid, especially early on, was trying to leverage the work like that came out of a social working group, things like activity streams, kind of things like ActivityPub. There's a common sub protocol called link data notifications that kind of has a lineage back to like PubSub Hubbub and stuff that both protocols use. But one big difference was that the social working group was like a chartered working group of the W3C, and Solid was just like, I think it was just sort of like a side project where they were, I think, rationally trying to move fast and get things done, but without the sort of formal bureaucracy of the way the W3C working groups work. So they were, I felt like they co-evolved and sort of benefit from one another, but they were kind of trying to accomplish different things. But a lot of people have heard about Solid because it's in the news here and there, because Tim's involved. Okay, let's talk about today. This is a repo to like an awesome ActivityPub list of all kinds of projects that implement this. They're like, I first implemented ActivityPub in 2016 or so, and it was just like a little sort of like notepad that you could just type messages to. It was really simple and kind of silly, but I just wanted to get hands-on with the protocol. But since then, people have done super, super amazing things that are, some are more general purpose than others. You see like Nextcloud Social is mentioned. Nextcloud is sort of like a G Suite. It's like a whole suite of web tools, and you can install a plugin that adds like social networking capabilities. There's things that are kind of like similar to video sharing websites like YouTube, but that where like the social interactions about those that happen on those videos do ActivityPub so that they can federate to other servers. There's probably a bunch more that aren't on this list. I actually really like this last one, which is like a bot that will like mediate a chess game between you and another person and you're sending like your moves back and forth via ActivityPub, and the bot will respond with like an image after each move with the image of the chessboard. I was playing that like earlier this week with some rando, and then they stopped responding to my moves, so I guess I win. But I don't know, I think that's kind of a fun example of when you have these little primitives that are well defined, people can do things that you didn't even come up with. There's sort of this like emergent set of properties that can come from defining even simple standards like this. A lot of people don't even know they're using ActivityPub, but because they're using it through this piece of open source software called Mastodon. I always forget this, but Mastodon was actually around before ActivityPub was standardized. And I think Christine told me earlier today that originally they were implementing like StatusNet and or ActivityPub and or GNU Social. Like, I don't really understand the differences, but then because like as this work got standardized, all of a sudden the core developers of this project were like some of the first developers that were like reading the standard, filing issues, pointing out the ambiguities, and it really helped like get that final polish on things to know that they could be implemented. And since then, it's taken off. I think I saw an estimate that at a very small minimum, like 10 million people are using Mastodon. It could be 5 times that. This is what it looks like to use. On the left is like a profile page. That's mine on the instance of Mastodon that the core development team hosts, mastodon.social. So that's what it would look like to like view if you click on my URL, this is like the HTML representation of my ActivityPub actor. And on the right is what it looks like when I logged in. So I have this sort of like news feed of micropubs, and people are posting about all kinds of things. Like, looks a lot like a site like Twitter or Facebook. But there's also some cool innovations, I think, in the consumption experience. Like, people, when they post things, can put content warnings that by default will like collapse messages that might trigger someone or be offensive or might be unwanted for some reason. And so having this like granularity of vocabulary for describing social data unlocks like end user features that might make some of these networks like a bit more safe to use. This is also totally blows my mind, but the European Union has been for a couple years, at least since 2018, working on this project called Next Generation Internet, NGI for EU, and they have been funding billions of dollars of euros or billions of euros worth of projects to help make Europe like spread European values on the internet. And that includes, I believe, some cross-pollination funding with like the US NSF and vice versa. So it's not necessarily just Europe. But a year or so ago, or maybe earlier, that's what I first saw a year ago, they started, the NGI for EU administrators started taking an interest in ActivityPub and hosted like a series of webinars that I linked to on the left that Christine showed up to and helped sort of explain to a very non-technical crowd that were like working on government of the various European Union countries, like how this protocol works, like what the implications would be. And then not that long ago, a month or two ago, the EU launched a social network called the EU Voice that is a deployment of Mastodon. And so this is like the European Union, the largest trade trade group in the entire world, is providing their own deployment of this protocol, and they call it EU Voice. And there's also EU Video, which is, I don't know if that's using existing open source software, it might be PeerTube or something, but they're kind of making like a government hosted social network and like video sharing site, which is a very different way than we do things here in San Francisco. This is what it looks like when you look at the NGI profile on EU Voice. So it looks, I believe it's maybe a fork of Mastodon or maybe just straight up Mastodon. And you can see they're using this like Twitter, they're announcing things. They have 680 followers, and those followers don't have to be on this deployment. They could be self-hosting their own server or using a friend server or something, or forming a local co-op to run like a ActivityPub server And as long as everyone implements the protocol right, like the end users get quite a bit of choice in how they participate in the network. They don't all have to like rely on the same company. So like from all this flexibility, there's this like term that emerged. Maybe it was there beforehand, but I only knew of this term after ActivityPub got popular. I guess you can see the history there, but there's a notion of like the Fediverse, like the federated universe of social web. Like they don't all have to be running the same piece of software. They may not even, all the different nodes may not even be speaking the exact same protocol, but one way or another, it's this giant distributed system, kind of like a giant global graph that has no giant single point of control. It's federated, but it's a universe, and that people can participate in it and kind of find their way around and get things done without having to choose like a top-down authority to participate within, and sort of have these fractured networks. It's like a giant mesh without a single center. You can see that Evan, who was one of the chairs of the social working group, it sounds like was, I don't know, part of the history of this. So I'm not surprised. He's really great as well. This is, I believe, the closest thing to like an official forum for ActivityPub. In ActivityPub Conf Prague, that was something that was being discussed, is like, wow, there's not, now that the W3C social web working group spun down, having completed its mission in 2018, it wasn't really clear where like interested parties should even collaborate on this stuff. But if you're curious, I definitely recommend like signing up for this forum, maybe turning it on mailing list mode so you find out what people are posting. But there's a handful of people that show up and talk about this stuff and sort of ideate on enhancement proposals and stuff. Today, there's also ActivityPub Conf that I think Christine worked really hard to organize a few of, and I hope other people are helping. In 20, this there on the web on the left, you can see like the page for ActivityPub conference on ConfTube, which I believe is a deployment of PeerTube, which is a like YouTube alternative that's open source and does federated social via ActivityPub. And then on the right, you can see a specific talk that I really enjoyed when I went to the version of this that was in Prague. I'm like sitting right up front. And it was called Architectures of Robust Openness, that was just really insightful, sort of opening my eyes to the world beyond ActivityPub for these sort of like decentralized protocols, and keynoted by like a very accomplished computer scientist. Okay, so that's sort of what's going on today. And here's like potentially possible futures. At that conference in 2018, Christine was working on this project called OCAP which was trying to help fill in some of the gaps on the security that was like left orthogonal to the ActivityPub protocol itself. And it turns out that's really relevant to like marginalized groups who might be getting harassed a lot on Twitter. They go to launch their own Mastodon instance, they're getting harassed again. And generally this is sort of, I think, kind of an unsolved problem of like how the protocol needs to support security features that can help end users not be spammed or DDoSed or harassed more than are strictly needed. And this is how I got introduced to this notion of like object capabilities, which is a authorization architecture that I believe has been used for 30, 40 years, but it's kind of different than the traditional like API token based auth that a lot of web services use. And I encourage you to read that paper. I was reading it the other night and I got to the end where there's sort of like an unfinished section, but it's definitely, I think it's interesting. I'd be down to like hear what other people think and maybe like try to carry the torch on that. Another way of changing things in the future with ActivityPub would be like by making an extension. This paragraph here is a screenshot from the text that mentions extensions. This is where like JSON LD comes into play. One way of doing extensions would be to set up a bureaucracy that has like the official list of extensions. If you want your extension in there, you have to like bribe the right person or like charm the right person to get them to add it to the list. But one of the, I believe, the benefits of like semantic web technology is that if you can host a URI on the web or anywhere really, you can define your own extension vocabulary, start using it in your data, and you don't necessarily have to like ask permission from a central committee to do that. And maybe once it catches on, if other people find it useful, you would have like proof that, hey, this is really interesting. Maybe we should sort of make this a more official extension. But I believe like there's not really any of this. Like, I don't think there are any like, or maybe there's one or two official extensions to ActivityPub, but I actually think this is sort of a success. I think a lot of people extend it by just bringing in other RDF vocabularies or defining a new one and trying to get people to use it. And so it's sort of this like permissionless extension process. And that's where JSON LD, in my opinion, shines, but other people don't necessarily like it. This is the second thing down here is a list is from the W3 wiki, and there's some ideas that someone added for potential possible future extensions. So you can see what kind of things people are coming up with. Anti-abuse I talked about. Maybe people want to do ActivityPub over WebSockets. That's like transcending HTTP. How would you do like search of an inbox? Here's some other ideas for possible futures, like, and we talked a little bit about this, ActivityPub over non-HTTP transports. WebSockets was listed on the last screen. I've been learning recently about libp2p, which is itself very pluggable in terms of how you can do what transports you could use. You can do, but one of the use cases I find kind of interesting is like how you could do ActivityPub in a local first or offline context, maybe like forming a group at Burning Man or something. Aaron, I see your hand up.
Do you have to control a URL that resolves to do an extension, or could you use a URN or something that doesn't actually resolve to do those extensions?
So check out this ID on the right over here. Like this is actually something that like back when we were sketching a lot of this, I would use a lot of URN UUIDs as URIs, and a bunch of people were like got mad at me because it wasn't resolvable, and I was like, no, they need to be like URIs should be allowed, not just URLs. I do believe that there's parts of the ActivityPub spec that say like an actor's ID needs to be resolvable, but it doesn't necessarily define how that is. And I'm kind of happy with that flexibility, but I think there's a lot of potential for defining things as just URIs, which by the way, like DID is a relatively nascent URI scheme that people are starting to use for like key agreement and stuff like that. So yeah, my answer, I don't know what the spec says, I forget, but my answer is that, yeah, like they don't necessarily have to be resolvable, but if they're not, that might be a barrier to interoperability with other systems made by people who are just like assuming HTTP or HTTPS. And so using different URI schemes like is a bit potentially a barrier to interoperability, but maybe there's a good reason for that. So yeah, I think I want to do some ActivityPub over libp2p to do some like offline social networking type things where you don't necessarily have to go through an ActivityPub server that's on the public internet. You could just discover peers around you via Bluetooth or MDNS or something and start sending these JSON blobs over at transports other than HTTP or TCP. Data integrity and like basically trying to make it so that when your server receives an ActivityPub message, how do you know it wasn't modified along the way? Like if you're using HTTPS, you probably are confident that there hasn't been a person in the middle. But if we could do like in the ActivityPub blobs themselves, signature schemes that proved what the original message was, then you could do ActivityPub over HTTP or over open networks or something, and still the other end, the person receiving your message could feel confident that it was what your friend actually sent you and not what was rewritten along the way. And I find that interesting because the EFF has posted multiple articles about in certain countries, like the governments will be a person in the middle of rewriting your HTTP requests and injecting like malware and stuff. So this isn't just like theoretical. There's, for example, activists that have been targeted by this sort of attacks. Content addressing or just other ways of sort of like deterministically hashing these whole objects using something like IPLD, so that which could have benefits for like caching or general decentralization. Like now I'm biased because I work at the company that makes it, but I've been kind of curious about that. A big issue that I would say is like one of the big weaknesses of ActivityPub right now is like, in theory, we decentralized a bunch of social networks, but in practice, you still have this problem of, I want to give you my identifier, which is like how you find me on the Fediverse. And for the most part, if that's just like a Mastodon deployment, I'm giving you a DNS domain name, probably an HTTPS URL, and that's great. But like, what if that server goes down later? Or what if someone does a hostile takeover of the company that like hosts the server or something? Like, there's all these. For end user safety, it would be ideal that you could have a single identifier that you could print on your business card or something, or put in a QR code, and then I would be able to migrate servers many times over the next 50 years without having to like tell all my friends to add me as the new identity, which kind of has lock-in effects if you don't have this sort of portability. So I think there's a lot of promise for using DIDs for that, which stands for decentralized identifiers. It's a big topic, but that's like, I think there's a lot of people interested in DIDs for portable identifiers that then could be dereferenced into your current ActivityPub server, which may be different than next year's ActivityPub server. Or maybe you actually have multiple because one is on a device that goes down or something, and the other one is, I don't know, better. And then I think this third thing I would highlight is related to the OCAP pub thing I mentioned before, basically applying authorization capabilities to ActivityPub, which would basically potentially let me like delegate permissions to post on my behalf to different apps or different devices I have, or maybe even to a friend. I could delegate the ability to post as Ben to my like executive assistant, but only if he types only about certain hashtags or something like that. And so that's one of the things that can, and that's what I sketched on the right, which is using this ZCAP LD ontology, which describes a proof relationship, which is like this ActivityPub message proving that basically this is the message I intended to send with a signature value, which I believe uses like multi-formats. Here's some other related work. I think that the team that at Blue Sky, which is a startup that I think Aaron works with, is doing a lot of cool stuff, not just locked within the limits of ActivityPub, but just like generally in the space of decentralized self-authenticating protocols. You should read about that. A lot of new stuff coming out by the day. Here's a website for Solid project. I also linked to the Sprightly project, which is Christine, the organization that Christine has founded and is now the CTO of. And there's some like really next level authorization capability stuff gestating in there. And yeah, I think I would also just point to some like relevant current events, like the hostile takeover of your social provider is like not just like 5 years ago, it was like a tinfoil hat conspiracy theory that I was worried about, but like it's also been in the news a lot in the case of Twitter. And I would also highlight some of the progress happening in Europe around the Digital Markets Act, where a lot of people, like GDPR a few years ago, really influenced a lot of even like San Francisco-based startups, because if they didn't fall in line and they had European customers and enough revenue, they would potentially be fined like 10% of their global revenues. And at least my experience amongst my friends when GDPR went into effect is like pretty much all my friends that worked at San Francisco startups, those startups stopped feature development for like 3 to 6 months and prioritized not losing 10% of their global revenue, which could be like their entire profit margin. And now there's like another piece of legislation that has been being worked on in Europe called the Digital Markets Act, which may actually legislate and have similar penalties for web businesses that do not use interoperable protocols, do not use like well-defined data vocabularies in their data exports. And it mentions down here that there could be another 10% global revenue penalty for choosing not to like comply with that law. So all this work on like interoperability stuff was like kind of just a cool idea 5 years ago, but now it's becoming a business reality for a lot of the organizations around the Bay. One of the last slides, like if you're sold and you want to get started, like there's a lot of ways you can do it. That's one of the benefits of it being like an open ecosystem. But these are the 2 apps I really like. On my iPhone, I use this one called Toot. I paid $4 for. I just found this other one the other day that is like an Electron app, I think, that runs on my Mac, Hyperspace, that is like really nice and sort of bigger and wider. You can browse more things at once. And they're made by completely different developers. They just implement the client to server interactions of the protocol. And if you're wondering like which server to use, this first URL will like help you find one that might be used by people with like common interests with you. Personally, I use Mastodon.social, which is made by like the core developers of that team. I used to self-host my own, and then I got sick of paying to maintain my own server, so I just use that one. And yeah, I would say like also start thinking about like before you hand out what your URL is to yourself on the Fediverse, like I don't know, is the domain name involved there something that you really feel confident is going to resolve like 5 or 10 years from now? And if that concerns you, then you might start looking into DIDs for that or some other mechanism. And yeah, you can, if you get on the Fediverse, you can go here and click follow and follow me, which I don't have that many followers. I don't, but I need to build an audience, I guess. That's the end. That's how you get started using ActivityPub, and that's kind of how it works. I'm happy to answer any questions and maybe punt to Christine if there's anything that I don't know the answer to.
Thank you so much, Benjamin. If you are able, come off of mute, give Benjamin a nice little round of applause. We don't have as many in-person events, so we got to get those claps in when we can. Does anyone have any questions?
I have questions, but I was going to let other people go first.
Has anyone used this stuff before? I mean, that's like my question for the group. Or heard of it, or tried it out, and it was good or bad?
I tried it
Not
once.
knowingly. Not knowingly. I haven't used it knowingly.
So it's early. You can get in on the ground floor.
You mentioned you used to run your own server, but switched to mastodon.social. Did that change your identity? Were you able to?
It didn't change my identity as a person, but it gave me
Did
a
it
new
change your
identifier to find
identifier?
out. So yeah, like that's one of the reasons for me, that scenario actually happened where I was like, I don't know, economic realities change. Maybe maybe you run a server for 3 years and then it's so popular that you start being a target of people trying to bring down the server because reasons. And so even if you feel very confident that you can like self-host your own thing for a while, like maybe you lose your job and you can't afford to anymore. Maybe you become a target and it becomes way more costly to maintain the thing. And I think that's a very unsolved problem in the space right now, which is portability, like decentralization, but also being able to take advantage of that decentralization by end users kind of like migrating from place to place as the world changes around them.
You talked about two protocols, one between the client and the server and one between server and server. Does stuff take multiple hops from server to server, or do I have to talk to the servers of anybody whose content I'm interested in?
I believe the answer is that it might take multiple hops, and there's like something where like if I send something to my outbox, it tries to fan out to people that can. If one of those deliveries can't succeed, maybe it's hidden network, then I think it can hop to someone else's inbox, might receive the message and try to send it out. But actually, I don't know. I haven't
Because that
implemented
brings
enough.
back to the security question.
I can answer this one. So the client to server protocol and the server to server protocol are two different things, and the server to server is widely implemented, and to our shock and surprise, genuinely, because there was a point at which we might not have gotten out the Federation standard in time, and we might have only shipped this client to server protocol. The client to server protocol has not been very well implemented. But let's say you were doing a client to server thing. It's like with sending an email, right? You send an email directly to you send something, you do SMTP to your, you do the message that you're sending to the server, and then the server does the message send to, somewhere else, right? So in that sense, there is a hop if you are doing client to server and server to server. That could be eliminated by having, if you had a peer-to-peer network, your client to server and server to server, you could just be doing client to server to localhost, right? But as in terms of having indirection from server to server, where I try sending it through here, and if not, I go through some relay, that doesn't really happen in ActivityPub. It's point to point. So your server, but if I'm sending one message that's to a list of addressees that are on 4 different servers, my server will contact 4 different servers to send to.
So that's very similar to SMTP, where they thought it was going to be long chains of store and forward, and then ended up being all the server to server connections had to be direct, or you couldn't trust it.
Yep. So yeah, and I actually think that the way that both SMTP and also the way that ActivityPub kind of as implemented has been picked up have moved towards this. Their notions of trust are both broken, which is a strong opinion from the last few years of research. But that's not important to this particular part, so I will be quiet for a bit.
I mean, one of the reasons I want to do some experimentation with ActivityPub over libp2p is like libp2p pub/sub, for example, is one of the ways that you can do pub/sub on libp2p is using this technique called gossip sub that I just linked to the paper of, where like it will do multi-hop stuff at a layer like abstracted away from sort of the application code that is doing ActivityPub. So you might just say, hey, pub/sub provider, like send this message out to people, and if it uses gossip sub, for example, that might involve routing across many peers to actually get to the person who's intended to receive it. But that's just sort of the beginning of an idea.
The interesting thing about doing things that way, though, is that it doesn't, from the point of view of the spec, you're still sending something point to point in terms of sending it to the other abstract address. It's that the underlying protocol is handling the abstraction of store and forward, right? But it's still, if you're thinking about it from an actor perspective, you're not relaying it through multiple actors at that abstraction level, right? So, and of course, you are always relaying things through other entities if you are speaking over IP, right? Like if you're on the global internet, right? Your any server is probably going to be relaying through several other things, unless if you happen to be like have two servers directly wired together, right? So which is not generally the way that the internet works. Some intranets, but not the internet.
Good point.
Great. Are there any other questions before I stop the recording?
I did want to clarify a couple things. So first of all, Bengo did an awesome job with this presentation, and actually covered some history that I didn't know too deeply about myself, because I didn't. Bengo and I both kind of followed, I think, two different versions of the early history, right? So I was very in the O status type community with StatusNet and so on, and Bengo was paying, I think, more attention to what was happening with activity streams and stuff like that. So with OStatus correctly being identified as being adopted by StatusNet and Identica and stuff like that, what happened from there is that after Evan Prodromo, who was the lead author of StatusNet, and kind of the OStatus collection. So one big difference with OStatus is that it was a kind of a collection of standards that were kind of awkwardly fit together and that they weren't broadly interoperable. And so there are people who would implement different versions of OStatus, and they would say that they had the same thing, but their servers wouldn't be able to talk to each other. And OStatus didn't support private messaging. There was no way to send a message directly to a single actor. Or there wasn't even really a very clear notion of actors. So what happened was Evan Prodromo started in Pump.io something called the Pump API, and that is where almost all of ActivityPub's core design came from. The whole idea of the client to server and server to server with the inbox and outbox and so on. What happened from there is that Erin Shepard, ERIN, she took the Pump API document and converted it into an early document, which Bengo did mention, called the Activity Pump. But what ended up happening with that was actually that we took that, when I came into the group, we actually took what Erin had done directly and started that as the basis for converting it over to ActivityPub. So it was really a combination of Evan and Erin's initial work. And Jessica, Talon, and I were the main people who kind of carried it through the process, with a whole bunch of other people in the group providing different roles in different ways. But the reason I bring this up is that Ebengo had mentioned that that was an inspiration. It wasn't just an inspiration. It was that we literally took that document and then we started rewiring it. One of actually the biggest differences that ended up happening was that originally it was required that you implement both the client to server and server to server stuff, because we just assumed you would want to do both. And then Amy Guy came and hung out for a weekend at my house and just banged out together, mostly Amy doing the work, the division between those two things, which I think was a big deal. So I'm rambling a little bit, but there's one other thing I wanted to say, which is that this was actually how I got involved in doing standard stuff at all, which I had never done before. And at the time, what happened was I was working on a project called Media Goblin, which was a decentralized media hosting thing. And we had promised federation, and I didn't actually know how to do it. So I had hired Jessica Talon as an intern initially, and then hired her on. And then when we heard about the social web working group, we said, I said to Jessica, well, we'll just join for an hour a week to make sure that our needs are met. And so an interesting thing you find out about standards is that that phrase, the revolutions are run by the people who show up, turns out to be very true, right? And so a lot of the things that I learned, we ended up learning because we ended up being the people who carried it forward, because we were the people who were available to do it and were passionate enough. But the last thing that I'd like to say, and I'm sorry, I know I'm kind of taking over the Q&A of this last bit, but the last thing that I think was interesting was that when we started working on, so nowadays ActivityPub is like, when people talk about the Fediverse and they talk about, decentralized networks, we're lucky that ActivityPub is, or at least my career has been lucky that ActivityPub is what people tend to refer to. But that it wasn't obvious that that was going to succeed. And actually, when I first got involved in the social web working group, my first work before doing standard stuff was trying to go and convince all of the decentralized. There actually were a bunch of different decentralized social networking applications, and none of them could talk to each other. So that's the main reason you want a standard, right? Is so that different things can talk to each other. And the main thing we were told is that you're never going to get that to happen because all these different groups hate each other.
Federation is less fun if nobody can talk to each other.
Right. So anyway, that's kind of some extra motivation of that stuff. Anyway, this isn't my talk, but I thought that was just kind of some interesting extra information to know. Bengo did a marvelous job on this presentation, as I already said. But I thought those were maybe some useful things to fill in.
Thanks, Christine. My last reflection would simply be that, like, we thought we were just going to try to make a decentralized social networking protocol. I definitely made a social network, which is like I met Christine, I met Amy, Evan. Like, these are people that I've stayed on and started touch with. So it's like maybe the social networking protocol was this social relationships we made along the way or something. It's probably a corny way of ending it.
I approve.
That note, before I hand it back to Paul to close us off, I'd like to take a brief moment to guilt trip everyone who's here. You're here because you love papers, and this is Papers We Love. We are looking for more speakers, so you can contact me either through Twitter, just DMing me at Aaron D. Goldman, or ping me through Meetup, or you can use the Slack that we have for Papers We Love. If you love papers and would like to present, please reach out to me so that I can help guilt trip you more directly into presenting one of these papers. Thank you very much. And with that, I'll hand it back to Paul.
Great. And this is my first time closing one of these events, so it might just be a thanks for coming. Really appreciate the talk you gave, Benjamin, and then the color that you added to it, Christine. Thanks to everyone who showed up. These things are so much better with the more people we have. And so thank you for being here this evening or this morning, wherever you are in the world. And with that, we will see you next time. Back to you.